Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalarin and I've been doing a hell of a lot of islands whenever I can in my free time. The island expeditions in Battle for Azeroth is a great way for you to farm Azerite power for your necklace so you can unlock different sets and bonuses for your Azerite gear, and as overall an efficient way to have some side hustle while you're doing the game. Whenever you're not getting your mythic dungeons done, or whenever you're not doing PvP, whenever you're not grinding out every single world quest, this is something you can do in your free time for multiple reasons. So in this video, I want to give you guys a guide on how to grind AP with islands. I want to talk to you about the mechanics and the general philosophy behind islands, how you can get into islands and be fairly successful, what kind of different combinations of groups you are to run, and some of the other things you should know when it comes to island expeditions in order to be as successful in this endeavor as you can. So what are islands? They're very similar to Mists of Pandaria scenarios, which is a 3-man group. Content can be done in PvP or PvE. Doesn't really have any specific roles that you have to fill, like healer, DPS, and tank, so it gives the players a little bit more flexibility in what kind of compositions they want to run, and it involves a lot of rares and mobs that function and fight in different ways. A lot of them are dangerous, and some might have spell casts, other might have mechanics like a big AoE that you have to walk out of, maybe a frontal cone that you have to sidestep, and a lot of them generally deal a lot of damage. Of course, on the islands you also have a bunch of treasures, mini quests, mini events, huge rares that need to be taken down, and of course an ever-changing environment. Like for example, you go to the south side of an island, there's nothing there. Give it 5 minutes, now all of a sudden there's a bunch of Azerite and Azerite golems, so now it gives you an incentive for you and your team to go and hit it. While you're doing all of these events or getting treasures or doing mini quests and mini objectives on the islands, you will have the enemy faction trying to stop you. Whether you're playing Horde or Alliance, you'll have a team of the opposite faction, PvE or PvP, trying to get the Azerite before you. Being able to hit the enemy team and stop them in their tracks, or being able to hit them while they're doing an event, is something that is encouraged in islands. So you can run this in PvE version, where you can have an NPC trying to act like a player. They'll try to jump, they'll try to chain CC, so they can be formidable, and those can be met at difficulties of normal, heroic, and mythic. Or you can just take it on into PvP, just fighting players versus players, trying to get the islands done, and that one can have varied results depending on who you queue with, depending on if they are PvPers or PvEers, also depending on the comp a lot more. Some of the island events are going to be rares, which are generally mobs surrounded by lesser mobs, and you pull them together and there's usually mechanics. You either have to interrupt them, or of course, as I said before, shockwave mechanics or big AoEs that you have to run out of. It is possible to CC a lot of these mobs. Sometimes mobs that are not even rares can do a lot of damage, so be on the lookout for any mobs that are hammering your team down. A lot of the mechanics, like the frontal cones and the AoEs, deal a lot of damage, so generally it's a good idea to get out of them or pop a defensive if you are going to stay in. And it's a good idea to sidestep it and run around, so a lot of scenarios ends up coming down to player responsibility rather than having a tank having to tank everything or a healer having to heal the group. It's a lot of responsibility onto your team to sidestep mechanics and avoid them. It's a lot up to your team to interrupt certain mechanics or chain stun certain mobs if you're trying to stop them from wiping your team. There's a lot of events on the islands, and they usually rotate, because for the week you have 3 different islands, and if you play same maps and you see same enemies, it gets pretty boring. Blizzard decided to add a bit of randomness to islands. So for example, let's say you have 3 different islands and you decide to queue in, you get the island A. Let's say one time you queue into Island A, you end up fighting against the Mogu, and there's a bunch of Mogu and they're having their own rares, and Mogu are all about casting spells, so as long as you're able to interrupt them, you should be good to go. The next time you end up queuing, let's say it's a bunch of Virkul, and the Virkul Vikings are all over the place, and they're less about being casters, but they're more about melee swings and frontal attacks. So now instead of trying to stop them from being able to cast spells, now you're trying to either interrupt them or sidestep their abilities, but if you don't sidestep those abilities, they'll do a lot of physical damage and maybe even one-shot you. So these islands will have different enemies that you fight. They'll have different events, like for example, you'll have events like where pirates come in, or Venture Co goblins decide to make a camp and you gotta drive them out, or maybe Azerite golems spawn in, now you gotta take them down and farm the Azerite around. It's a lot of randomness, there's a lot of RNG to this, just to keep the island expeditions a little bit more healthy and exciting. If you're playing the islands through the normal or the heroic version, then your composition doesn't really matter. You get matched up with random players and it allows you to blast through the islands fairly easily, as long as you respect the mechanics, respect the rares, and respect the opposite faction, as sometimes it can be a thorn in your side. When you do these island expeditions on Mythic or player versus player, it forces you to get a preset group together before queuing in. That means you're going to have to think about compositions. Now, compositions are fairly easy. It doesn't force you into a healer, DPS, or a tank role. You can kind of pick whatever you want, but you don't want to have too many healers, for example. If you are going to grab healers, you will want to take a look at how much damage they output, because part of the island expeditions is a DPS race. So if you can grab healers that can do damage, like Discipline Priest, who can output pretty good damage, as well as great healing on a whim, those guys will be able to help the group solo the content and help the group take mobs down, whether it's a huge pack or a huge boss, while being able to adapt to a more defensive playstyle in case the other faction rolls in on you. If you are going to consider healers outside of a Discipline Priest, they will have to spec themselves and gear themselves to be as helpful in terms of damage increase for their team as possible. Most of the team is going to be comprised of DPS, but it's a question of what kind of DPS do you want to run. Do you want to run DPS that are built for PvE, or do you want to gear yourself more for PvP and do a lot of hit and run missions trying to take out the enemy faction? Do you want to give yourself some DPS that are all about mashing damage, like Arms Warriors and Demon Hunters that don't really have a lot of self heals? Or do you want to maybe bring someone who doesn't deal nearly as much damage as those two, like an Elemental Shaman, but who brings a bunch of totems like the Fear Totem, Slow Totem, Stun Totem, as well as Earth Shield, Off Healing, Knockback, Earthquake, and lots more. If you are going to bring any tanks, I think the best tanks for these right now are, if you are going to bring a tank that's there for self-healing, like a one tank double DPS combo, Blood Death Knights, Vengeance Demon Hunters, and maybe even Prod Pallies. Most of those tanks either bring the Paladin Silence from the Prod Pally, or the Mass Grip for the Death Knight and Bone Storm for damage, or pure DPS and a bunch of sigils for Vengeance Demon Hunter to be able to AoE mobs, kite him around, CC him around with fears and silences, and be able to overall control the battle with a hyper offensive playstyle. I feel when it comes to making your comps, there's a lot of flexibility and a lot of playability of how you want to run. I feel like down the line we will have certain set builds and certain set compositions that most people will end up running, but because this content is pretty fresh, I feel like there's a lot of room for flexibility, especially when it comes to PvP. You can choose to make yourself a PvP team with a bunch of rogues, or go for a tank double DPS combo, or double DPS healer combo, or triple DPS and all hybrids that help each other out. There's a lot of possibilities and a lot of flexibility in how you can build your characters and how you want to run for the island expeditions. Currently, islands are pretty good for AP farming if you're trying to get as much AP for your necklace, but there are some other purposes. Every single week for the island expeditions, you can get yourself a cap. However much Azerite you end up collecting from the island expeditions, once you reach that cap, you get yourself a good chunk of AP just for free for accomplishing them for the week. So you'll want to get that done at least once a week. Outside of that, if you continue spamming island expeditions, you get sometimes a chance for a satchel to drop you goodies. Most of those goodies will be doubloons, which you'll be using in the vendor on the islands in order to get you different augmentations to help you do these islands a little bit faster, whether it's more damage or whether it is less damage taken from magic abilities, maybe even certain items to help you clear the mobs. The rest of the time, you will be getting random goodies that can be rare mounts and maybe even rare items that you can put in the auction house, whether they are BOEs that you might be able to get yourself to increase your item level, or simply transmog type of gear like the floppy fish, for example, comes from the island expeditions on a random chance. So besides the weekly cap, it's a good way for you to farm AP. Besides farming AP, it has a chance to reward you goodies, and they're fairly easy to do, and because of the random nature, it is difficult to get tired of them. Because of the flexibility of how they're structured, you can get yourself a triple DPS team, you can get yourself a DPS healer combo, you can even go triple tank if you want to, so there's a lot of flexibility of how you can run. It is really difficult to not do island expeditions, and you literally have no excuse not doing them. I feel like it's worth running, and that's something I've been doing in my free time in order to make sure to keep up with my necklace so I can unlock more Azerite bonuses on my gear. Anyway guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope this guide gave you as much information you needed on the islands. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see all of you in the next one.